Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 27th season, I interview artists about their craft, what they're doing now, what they've accomplished in the past, what's in the future. We often have poets on and other brands of writers, but we cast a wider net than that. We have had on artists, we have had on sculptors, we've had on playwrights are writers, I guess. Actors, I meant to say, musicians, all sorts of various artists. So if you have an idea for someone who might be a good guest for the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the program. We'd be glad to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block, along with all the other original programming out of Cape Ann TV, is a result of cable access television. You don't get this service, and it's an important community service, with dish subscriptions to television. Watch out for those dish commercials. Don't pay any attention to them. You stick with cable and the Writer's Block in our other programming. Tonight, I'm very happy to say we do have a different sort of artist, not a writer, or I should say a writer and an artist. He is a wire sculptor, and his name is Brian Murphy. He's originally from Massachusetts, Millis, Massachusetts, to be specific. He was educated in Framingham and then later at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He migrated to the Midwest for a master's degree in social work and is now a practicing counselor and has been practicing since he graduated. Besides moving back in practicing counseling in Massachusetts, he has also taken up over the last couple decades a career in art, a career specifically in wire sculpture and in writing connected with the wire sculpture that he creates. And we're going to talk to him tonight about his dual careers. Brian, welcome to the Writer's Block.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for coming down. I mentioned before the show I wanted to talk about that blend of a career. You make a living as a clinical social worker. You counsel kids, I think specifically.
That's right. It's a child
young
program.
adults,
Yep.
children's program, and that's busy, and I know it can be very stressful.
Yes.
Is art something that allows you to escape from that, or is it on top of it, or is it parallel? Or how does the art fit in with a working career?
Well, you know, it was initially a way of integrating the art treatment with children in trauma. And I work with a lot with children who are not very expressive. And so what I found was that when you were working side by side and you're making art together, there seemed to be a way that there was a gaining of sort of a trust level with each other by working on something together. And by working side by side, it was kind of like when you're in the car and you're talking to somebody in the car, you notice you could be more expressive and you don't have to be like face to face.
The faces aren't
right.
Yeah.
So same way doing this. So I work with a lot of adolescent boys who have like 1 or 2 word answers to everything. And so doing this really allowed them to be focusing down here and bending something wire and creating something together. And as we were doing that, they started to become more expressive and more verbally adept. And then by the end, you had a product that you then took out of the therapy space, and then they could remember more efficiently what you talked about. And later on, they sometimes come back and say, remember that time we worked on that horse together, and that was like several years ago, but it really helped me a lot. So that's how it initially started.
So that out of your work.
Yes.
Did that practice itself evolve out of courses that you took when you were getting a master's in social work on art as therapy?
No,
in general sense.
Actually, it was a very sort of a self-taught sort of concept later on in my career. It was something I decided I wanted to do more explicitly. And so what happened was that I started to do more drawing and painting and doing other creative things as a way of getting people to express themselves more efficiently. And then over time, I realized this was something I was quite good at. And so I decided to move from a regular treatment program that was in Watertown, and I moved into the South End in Boston. And I got a space that was an artist's loft space. And children come there and they make sculpture there. And they talk about their issues and their problems, and then they take the sculpture with them.
So you were sort of in the forefront of this trend. It seems to me to be a trend of using art as therapy.
Yes, yeah.
Which was unheard of when I was a child.
Yeah, I think it's much more conducive to helping people become more expressive. And I think what happens is instead of it being sort of a sterile room where you're just sort of doing this sort of, I don't want to say interrogating, but there's sort of a sense of trying to find out what the problem is, and everyone's feeling a little bit tense. You're doing something which is much more freeing and much more expressive. So that developed, and so that it became more and more a part of my daily life.
Independent of the therapy.
Right. So right now it's about, I do 50% art and 50% therapy still.
Is that in terms of time?
Yes, in terms of time. So what happens now is that I go into my therapy space and I will see somebody for like half the day, and then the other half the day I'll be making sculptures. And then I do shows, and I do a lot of like things right there in the South End where people come in every first Friday and they come see the gallery space. And a lot of times in the summertime, I'll come up to spaces like Rocky Neck here in Gloucester.
I wanted to mention that you have had shows where in Gloucester and where in Rockport.
So in Gloucester, in Rocky Neck, and in Rockport, some of the shops down there just sort of not really direct shows, but just
So in different summers.
Right.
And I know I've been to a couple of your shows.
Right.
And there were several in preceding years before I started going.
right, all right.
And you plan being here this summer?
Yeah, this summer I hope to be here also. Yeah, so it's Gallery 53. Is the name of it.
Gallery 53 on Rocky Neck.
Right.
Everybody remember that. At what point, how many years ago, did you separate, not that they're separated anymore, but did you conceive of making and selling and showing sculptures separate from therapy?
So this started about 15 years ago, and then more like 10 years ago, it became much more going out into the world and being sort of involved with.
So around the turn of the century,
Right.
you saw that separation.
Right. And it became much more sort of involved with a lot of different other groups and other sort of communities, activities. And I do a lot of workshops and trainings in after-school programs and in community colleges and in programming. We're helping children just become, in theater groups. I recently did a show where it was called One Hen, where it was a children's program about
What was the name again?
One Hen.
One hen?
Yeah. So it's all about an African tribe where there's one boy who gets a hen, and he develops a sort of whole working way of doing selling eggs from the hen, so that he can support his sister going to school, and that becomes the way that he helps the community and helps his sister. And so there was a play that Roxbury Community College did, in which I sort of did all the costumes and helping them sort of do all the sort of wire work for the show.
You've brought some wire work.
I did.
And also a book, ABCs, Totally Wired ABCs. And I want to turn now to a couple of these sculptures that you've brought. Are any of them in the book? The ones you
These, no.
Or-
This one here.
Let's talk about one of these.
Okay.
And then which one should we start with?
Why don't we do that one? So
Okay. So do you have the backup or the background? We're going to show one of the wire sculptures that Brian Murphy has created, and we're going to use a background, white background, so that we can see the black wire highlighted against the background. Yeah, that's good right there.
So this is
Describe that for us.
yeah, this is an elephant in the rainforest, and so basically this is part of one of the figures I have in my book, which is they're all on blocks, building blocks, which are alphabet blocks, and so this is E, which is E is for elephant in a rainforest, and so they're all meant to sort of have vibrating sort of energy to them, and so it picks up sort of when you walk around, it sort of starts moving and it gets energized. And that for me, a lot of it is the art should be about energized feeling and a feeling of uplift and sort of joy and happiness. So when I realized that this was...
Let me see if we can move that. Move that right on the paper there.
Oh, yeah. There we go.
Get a little, and then the movement. The elephant himself or itself is in black. You can't see this on screen, but the umbrella is green. The top of the umbrella is green. And there is a plasticine mount on which the rear legs of the elephant are attached, to which they're attached, so that you can imagine this a little more three-dimensionally, although it's a two-dimensional sculpture, but it's,
So,
thank you. Now, we should explain, before we go to another sculpture, the book, because we're going to be referring back and forth here.
Right.
I'm going to hold up, as Connor sprints from one camera to the other. Our cameraman, Connor, is getting workout this evening. This is your recently published book, Totally Wired ABCs by Brian Murphy. And this is a book about sculpture, and it's also a children's book
that's right.
to help learn.
The alphabet, and also it has sort of a rhyming sort of couplets that go through it.
We'll look at a couple pages in here. It's a brief introduction here, as explaining the book, and each of the pages has a couple of letters. For instance, C is for cat, D is for dino, and it says, C is for cat who sleeps on the floor. And now I can't read
D is for dino,
and dino is for dino,
who now is no more.
who now is no more. When did you conceive this book? And when did,
So this is sort of started about 10 months ago, and it actually comes out of doing, again, work with therapy with kids, in that often we do their life story book with each of the kids I work with. And so basically it's where do you come from, where have you lived, what are some of your experiences, and they will draw pictures and they'll...
this is during the interrogation.
This is the interrogation, yeah. This is now the fun and interesting sort of therapy. And as they're making a book, they complete it, and then they have something that they take home with them where they talk about their feelings and thoughts that they write down in this book, and it's the life book that they do. And I said, that would be a really neat thing to do, is to like start writing books that, for myself, about my own ideas about where do things come from, and ideas about just humor and sort of uplifting fun things. And so one of the things I do with the kids is say, so let's do an alphabet sort of exercise, whereas A is for what, and what does that thing do? So they may say, A is for aardvark, who, walks, in the jungle. And so you like jot that down or you paint that. So I said, I'm going to do that for myself. And so I made all these figures on alphabet books with rhyming couplets about what does each figure do. And that was the original thought of the book.
So this began in early 2016,
Yes.
and it's available where?
So it's Amazon, and it's all you do is just go online and just say Totally Wired ABCs Brian Murphy, and it will pop right up, and then you can order it from Amazon.
Before we go to another sculpture, and we have three others I'd like to talk about. I'm interested in a question that related to the earlier question about whether this came out of your art, and it did. Originally, if going back a few decades, do you think your desire to be a therapist or counselor and your desire to be an artist came out of the same original springs, the same DNA sequences back there in the original Brian Murphy?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the original idea was because I was very interested in social justice issues, and I think a lot of that made me feel like I wanted to become more aware of what that was and how to carry that out in the world. And I thought the best way of doing that is by becoming a social worker, and because I was very interested in change and trying to bring about change on sort of a micro and macro level. And I heard that one of the best programs was out in Michigan, and it was a very sort of dynamic, interesting group of professors out there. And because they had originally were the ones who took to the streets and actually had challenged a lot of the assumptions about the values and attitudes of the country at the time. And by the time I got there, they were still doing a lot of that work, and I learned a lot about social activity and about community organizing.
So Michigan was a good choice.
Yeah. Yeah, so
'Cause every university in the country has a social work program.
it does, it does. But this was actually one of the more radical programs in the country, and it was a much more of a proactive, into the community sort of thing that a lot of the schools in Boston, I think, are much more Ivy League, sort of ivory tower sort of thing, where people stay within the thing and not as much going out in the community. But I felt Michigan really was, sort of like trying to bring about change out in
So
the world.
Michigan's not just football and basketball.
No, not at all. But when I went out there, I was working in a runaway shelter called Ozone House. It was very alternative, very sort of cooperative.
In Ann Arbor?
In Ann Arbor. And it was a big house, and the kids would come there, and their parents would come there, and would sort of work out their problems so that the kids would then go home. But it was like a very dynamic, interesting
These are
time.
younger kids from high school level?
These like high
Or were
school.
these college
No, these
students who were kind of...
the kids were running away. We're all like high school kids, yeah, usually 13 to 17.
So you were practicing there before you
Yes, yeah.
before you
Yeah.
left.
So that was before I was even involved with anything. I was working out there too.
Let's look at another sculpture. If you could hold up the background again, would you describe...
So this is like actually a series that I'm doing for my second book, which is called Gina Loves Gary.
say the title again?
It's called Gina Loves Gary, and it's all about girls and their pets. And it's all, again, it's an alphabet book. So it's all about the name of the character would be the same as the animal. So it's a giraffe. So it would be Gina Loves Gary loves a giraffe, and the giraffe's name is Gary. So all of them are all different girls with different pets, and they all have similar.
And this is Gary the giraffe.
Gary the giraffe, right?
Is Gary in the book?
No,
Or-
so this is the next book that I'm doing right now.
The next book?
Yeah,
When will that be out?
6 months.
And that's titled
Gina Loves Gary.
Gina... Oh, did you just say that
Yeah.
was the title?
No, but
oh.
that
Gina Loves Gary.
yeah,
Okay.
is the name of the
Gina
book.
Loves Gary.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a giraffe and Gina.
Right.
Okay, good, thank you. I want to ask a couple specific questions
Yeah.
about the sculptures. What gauge wire?
So this is 16 gauge, which allows it to have that vibration and movement, but it also holds its strength really well over time. So this will, be there for like 20, 30 years without any problems.
It's not going to ever lose its shape
No.
unless somebody sits on it
Right,
or
will
falls.
never lose its shape. And so even with figures that are really movable, they will retain their shape for a long time.
Do you do an outline on paper
So-
before? Describe the process.
Yeah, so half and half. So if it's something that looks fairly representational, I will just do it off the top of my head and create it. If it's something that looks more abstracted or looks more like an engineering issue, I'll sketch it out first. So there's a lot of figures that I do that are very moving. They do a lot of sort of dance moves. And because of that, you sort of sketch that up first to make sure that it's going to work in terms of the energy and the space and the movement part.
So if this is Gina?
Yep.
If Gina were, say, higher, she might be attached and drawn off, formed from the giraffe, for instance. They would move
Yes.
sort of together, but they'd be independent characters.
Right.
They're both grounded here in
Yep.
the plastic mount. So if it's intricate, you do outline it on paper.
Right, yeah.
And then how long would something like this take?
So probably about 45 minutes. And but I tell people that's years of practice, so it's like when I first started, it took a really long time. But I think a lot of this is supposed to be make people smile and make people feel when they going through a sort of a tough time, and they'll see something like this, they'll go like, oh, that's a very nice, sweet sort of thing.
It does seem like a light, well, clearly because it's one-dimensional,
Right.
thin lines. It would lend itself more to humor
Mm-hmm.
or lightness. Have you tried sadness in any of these?
Yes,
Does it work?
it does work. It's just I don't feel as
You're not a sad guy.
drawn to it as the humorous parts. But there's an awful lot of artists out there who do very serious stuff, and I feel like there's a need to bring more joy or more happiness through art. So that's what I'm sort of pulled towards.
I want to make sure we get to all of the
So this,
pieces that you brought here is an intricate
yes,
piece.
so this is a piece that I would have drawn out beforehand. And so this one is sort of a guy who's sort of admonishing his dog and sort of like, sort of wagging his finger at the dog here. And
So, and his arm is out from the plane of the sculpture a bit.
right. And so that will go for, a good 30 seconds. And that's just a little bit of the energy that you just give it a little bit of a touch, and it will just go and go and will go.
Yeah, the dog's a little mean looking.
It's I meant for him to be a little more sweet, but yeah. So this is him sort of blaming the dog for something. This is his fault. So
What's the name of this?
the piece is blaming him for the bad smell. I think it was something like that.
Well, and you sell in
Yes,
studios,
right.
in your own studio.
Right.
Are any of your pieces available in Gloucester or Cape Ann?
Actually, there were none over the winter, but I need to.
They're not over the winter.
Right.
So, okay, cool. Well, most of the galleries are all closed.
Right. Right.
So if you want to stay in Cape Ann, we'd have to wait for your next exhibit up there.
Summertime. Yeah.
Or go to your studio in
Right.
Boston,
Which is 450 Harrison Avenue in the South End in Boston.
450 Harrison.
Right.
That's a big building
Yes.
converted to,
So it used to be like
Artist spaces.
a textile sort of mill sort of thing space that's been converted to art space. Yeah.
again, the address,
450 Harrison Avenue.
450 Harrison Avenue. But we're also supering your website
Yes.
so people can find
Yeah.
that information.
So it's one of the connecting sort of like landmarks is the Pine Street Inn, and it's right next to that. And there's all that big building that's going on, the ink, block there down that area.
So this is a good example of something that's more intricate. I should say well, we don't have to hold up the background again, but the dog's face comes out of the plane
Yeah, more three-dimensional.
about a half an inch,
Yeah.
and the man's flexible arm not only moves, but it's out from the plane, the surface plane a bit as well.
Right.
So it's very active.
Very active.
Now, these are all constructed so that they can stand on a small mount. They're balanced well.
Right, so actually half and half are, the other half is for wall mounting. So actually you can put things on the wall also. And they'll often will be on backgrounds where they can still move, but they're wall pieces too. So they're not just table mounted pieces, but so it really depends what you want. And so a lot of people ask me to do commissions for them, and basically at this point I can do anything that people want to do in terms of expressing a certain thing.
Do people bring you photographs?
They do. Yeah, they bring photographs of their dog. A lot of people bring photographs of each other where they want a couple piece done, where they want something that represents them. Usually it's sort of a loving sort of embrace.
Do you find that you're able to capture something significant about their personalities? That,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you can't do really close representational images here, but
Right.
you get something that,
I do a lot of weddings too also, so people will do something for the top of their cake. And so like one I recently did, the husband was a big hockey player and the wife was a nurse. And so he was all in sort of hockey kind of gear, and he was like picking her up and she had like a stethoscope around her neck. So it was like just this idea of like, where do you come from and how do you sort of see yourself? So yeah.
we have one more sculpture. I want to make sure we get to all of them. This is another dog related
So
sculpture. And what is the title of
this
this?
is called Walking the Invisible Dog.
Walking an Invisible Dog. So we see the head,
So yeah, so this is just sort of, I do a lot of people walking dogs, and this one is just sort of, the dog's body is invisible, and so you just see the head part of it. So it sort of gives you a sort of a minimalist, your brain almost fills in the rest of the body.
so in the left leg, well, you can't tell if it's the right or left leg, but one leg is mounted
Right.
on the plastic, and the other is in the air, so there's a sense of motion and progress there.
Right. So that's, again, this whole idea of like, movement and energy, so you want to give that,
This is titled again, Man,
Walking the Invisible Dog.
Walking the Invisible Dog.
So a lot of the titles of the pieces are meant to be humorous and philosophical and sometimes political. And so almost the title is like a good 30% of the piece because it gives you an added sense of it. So that's one of the things I like to do is that.
You spend half your time counseling,
Right.
and then half of a day on sculpture.
Mhm.
Is more and more of that time eaten up by not creativity, but
Other things.
sending out letters and making appearances on television shows? and
Yeah.
that sort of
Right.
backup work?
Yeah, I mean, recently I was, when Calder, the Calder show was up at the Peabody Essex Museum, I went up and gave a weekend workshop up there for like 15 people who wanted to create art like Calder. And so I basically taught them how to do sculpture like Calder would. And so they all did about 5 or 6 pieces a piece.
Up here in our neighborhood, huh? Salem,
And so then they all like walked home with a big box full of sculpture that was very sort of Calder-esque.
Wire, all wire?
All wire stuff, yeah. And then none of them had background in art, and they just were remarkably gifted for people who had never done this before.
Were they teachers or?
So these were, they were all women who basically were members of the Peabody Essex Museum, and who were looking to become more expressive, in some way or other. And so they just.
When was that, Brian?
So this is about a year ago when the Calder, exhibit was at.
I
at the
remember
museum.
seeing it,
Yeah.
yet I did not get to it.
Yeah, it was a really great show. So Calder, of course, is the grandfather of wire, and so that's who's originally sort of stimulated me.
I want to hold this up one more time. We're almost out of time, and I'm going to close the show on this camera in a second. But I wanted to make sure that we mention Totally Wired ABCs, Brian Murphy's new book, once more. I'm going to close on this camera. That's true, I am going to close on this camera. I want to thank Brian Murphy for being with us this evening. It's always a pleasure to have a non-writer. We do emphasize writers, and I love writers, but it's good to have a little variety in the program. And I think this was a fun program. If you've learned something about Brian Murphy's art, how it evolved out of counseling, and the magic of wire sculpture, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.